What do you know about children who became killers? How about a 9-year-old boy who cold-bloodedly devised a brutal plan for revenge? Or a teenager whom even adults were afraid to talk to? And at the end, you'll learn about a child whose crime is so monstrous that even judges couldn't hold back their tears.
A child doomed to darkness.
Kane Parks was only 13, but his gaze had long since lost the childlike spark. An ordinary-looking teenager, he was seen on the street by neighbors with confusion and fear. Beneath his calm exterior lay a tumultuous nature, boiling with unspoken resentments and uncontrollable rage. Kane became a source of concern for the school, neighbors, and even the police. But no one suspected that this was just the beginning. Like many children, Kane needed love, but his mother, immersed in alcohol and her own problems, only deepened his isolation. Every time he returned home and saw her in a state far from normal, he understood. He was alone. Without control and care, the child lost his sense of direction. In his young mind, one thought became obsessive. If no one cares about him, he must control others. His cruelty became his only form of power, and aggression was what he believed would save him from oblivion. One day, the situation reached its peak. A quarrel with a neighbor over a simple video game turned into a deadly trap for Kane. In a fit of rage, he grabbed a knife and struck in a way that left no chance for reversal. This fateful moment sealed his destiny. At the trial, he might have understood what he had done, but the father of the deceased couldn't comprehend how this boy stood before him like a stone without regret.
Unable to bear it, he lunged at Kane and ended his life where a just sentence should have been delivered.
And just when I thought things couldn't get worse, a new tragedy appeared on the horizon.
Which I will now tell you about. Becky Sloan, innocence poisoned by evil.
In 1999, 11-year-old Becky Sloan appeared to be an innocent girl, but behind her appearance lurked a dark side. Her cruel upbringing left a deep mark on her soul, and at home, she felt used and unwanted. In her family, parents saw her as a way to get benefits, but never showed warmth. Her insatiable thirst for dominance and violence seemed almost paradoxical to those around her, but Becky wasn't born cruel. She grew up in a family where each day was a trial. Her parents saw her only as a convenient way to receive benefits, so the only attention she received was harshness and constant reminders that no one owed her anything. Gradually, she became accustomed to the idea that the world was a place where either you control others or you are simply destroyed. The inner pain grew, and Becky found an outlet for it in her harshness toward other children. When her younger brother took her toy, an uncontrollable rage flared in her eyes. She did something that, perhaps, she regretted at some point. But the realization was short-lived and weak. At the trial, where the sentence was expected, Becky sat with a cold expression. It seemed that there was nothing human left in her soul. Her grandmother, the only person who had ever tried to understand her, couldn't withstand the cold look from the girl. In a moment of despair, she attacked her granddaughter, threatening her with a knife, severing the last thread that connected Becky to her human side. You might think this is the worst case? Let's take a look into the dark world of Alex Harper, whose battle with himself ended so horribly.
Alex Harper, the ghost of loneliness.
Lonely 14-year-old Alex Harper, whose case occurred in 2010, was known as an outcast in his neighborhood. Raised in a dysfunctional family where his father, George Harper, often beat him, and his mother, Julie Harper, ignored his suffering, he became closed off and grim. Alex was raised in a family where his needs were ignored, and even the smallest mistakes were met with brutal punishment. His father, unemployed and on the verge of a nervous breakdown, often beat him, while his mother was too busy surviving to notice her son's suffering. Loneliness became not just a state for him, it was his prison. For hours, he sat alone in his room, nurturing dark thoughts and filling with hatred for a world that had betrayed him. In these walls, where no one heard his cries, Alex gradually came to see violence as his only form of defense. One day, when a classmate tried to approach him to start a conversation, Alex saw it as a threat. In a moment of uncontrolled fear, fear, he pushed the boy into the path of an oncoming car. Seconds later, the lives of both teenagers were ruined. At the trial, when the judge pronounced the verdict, the mother of the deceased boy couldn't take it anymore.
She rushed at Alex and, consumed with rage and despair, struck him.
His fate was sealed, and the town would long remember this incident as a reminder that alienation sometimes breeds monsters. Just when we think everything is crystal clear, Emma Jones appears, and her life is a true tragedy, full of pain and disappointment.
Emma Jones, a childhood without love.
In 2012, 10-year-old Emma Jones, at first glance, seemed like a carefree girl. But dark realities hid within her life. Raised by her cold and strict grandmother, Helen Jones, she never felt warmth or care. Eventually, her fantasies became cruel. Emma grew up with her grandmother, who was far from a gentle, caring woman. Harsh and cold, she often punished the girl for the slightest transgressions, humiliating her and making her feel worthless. This coldness and lack of love transformed Emma into a withdrawn child, filled with pain. Gradually, her fantasies became filled with cruelty, and her dolls became the only witnesses to her dark thoughts. She believed that one day she would find freedom from this life. One day, tired of the abuse, Emma made a desperate decision. In a moment of weakness, she added poison to her grandmother's tea, intending to end her pain. Her crime was uncovered, and she was soon called to trial. At the trial, her relatives, shocked by the girl's cruelty, looked at her as if they saw a monster. One of her aunts couldn't take it anymore. She rushed at the girl with a knife, ending the story that began with despair and a child's dream of freedom. Emma, unable to find love, met her end in the cold courtroom where she once hoped to find justice. But how often do we underestimate the pain hidden behind a smile? Jonathan Myers is next on our list.
Jonathan Myers, a stubborn one without fear.
Jonathan Myers was 14, and at his age, he was already considered the cruelest teenager in the area. His peers feared him, and teachers only shook their heads when his misdeeds were mentioned. Jonathan feared nothing and no one, and neither fights nor adults intimidated him. For him, the world was a battlefield, and he walked through it without looking back. His story, like many others, began with an unhappy family. His father left them when Jonathan was just 5 years old, and his mother, burdened with work and worries, rarely paid attention to him. He grew up fending for himself, and the feeling of loneliness filled his soul. Gradually, he realized that there was nothing to fear if you didn't think about the consequences. Anger settled in his soul, anger at the world for taking his childhood away. One day, this anger spilled out. In a fit of uncontrolled rage, Jonathan attacked his younger sister, accusing her of stealing all of his mother's attention. Her death marked the beginning of the end for him. At the trial, when the judge pronounced the sentence, the mother, having lost both children, suddenly couldn't hold it in anymore. She approached her son, and her eyes burned with anger. She attacked him, ending the story of the young criminal who had never known real love or protection. And just when I thought all these cases were alike, Lisa Hawke appears, and her tragedy shows how invisible wounds can lead to terrible consequences.
Liza Hawke, victim of silence.
Liza Hawke was a short girl with gray eyes and a quiet voice. At 11 years old, she rarely spoke to anyone, was silent, and always kept to herself. Her classmates teased her, but she never complained. Her mother thought she was shy and quiet, but her silence hid suppressed suffering. Lisa grew up in a family where no one heard her voice. Every time she tried to get her parents' attention, they forced her to stay quiet. Her father often said that girls should be calm, teaching her to suppress herself. But inside her, anger had been growing. One day, when her younger brother took her doll, something inside her snapped. She strangled her brother, not understanding what she was doing. The trial marked the end of everything she knew. During the proceedings, her father, seeing his daughter, suddenly couldn't hold himself together. Overcome with grief and the realization that his indifference had created a monster, he attacked Liza, ending her life at the moment it should have just begun. Things take an even darker turn when we hear about Nathan Drake. His cry for help was so loud
that it seemed like the whole world should have heard it. Nathan Drake, The Last Cry for Help.
Nathan Drake was a 15-year-old boy whose life was filled with grievances and pain. His soul burned with rage, and only those closest to him knew the darkness hidden behind his outward calm. His sharp features and silent gaze gave him a grim appearance.
But it seemed no one noticed that behind this grim facade was a cry for help.
Nathan grew up in a world where violence and indifference reigned. His father, a war veteran, could not cope with the memories of his experiences and often took out his frustrations on his son. His mother, immersed in her own problems, was almost absent from his life. He grew up in fear and isolation, becoming increasingly withdrawn every day. A sense of helplessness and vulnerability pushed him to the edge of a cliff. One day, Nathan couldn't take it anymore, and, gathering all his strength, decided to respond to the violence. He used a weapon he found in his father's house. At the trial, his parents, sitting in the courtroom, appeared broken. Nathan, with an expression full of exhaustion and sadness, looked at them, but between them, there was nothing left but walls. At that moment, his father, realizing the pain he had caused, lunged at his son, ending their shared journey, which should have been full of hope and love.
Kyla Stevens, Shadow of Hate.
Kyla Stevens was 13. She always looked like a typical teenage girl with dreams of the future, but in reality, her dreams were filled with dark, cruel thoughts. At first glance, her life seemed normal, but those who knew her understood that behind her cheerful smile was something much darker. Kyla had been accepted into an elite school where she excelled academically. However, her success sparked envy among her classmates. Every day, she faced mockery and bullying, and her attempts to fit in with the group were unsuccessful. Gradually, the hatred she felt toward her tormentors turned inward. Unable to cope with her suppressed feelings, Kyla began thinking about revenge. The day she decided to take drastic action, one of her classmates mocked her again. In a fit of rage, Kyla grabbed a knife she kept in her bag. At the trial, as she looked sadly at her family, she understood everything. Her revenge had turned into a terrible crime, and her life had become a real hell. At that moment, her mother couldn't hold herself together, rushing at her daughter with a cry for help. With this act, she tried to stop what she believed could no longer be fixed.
Kyla lost her chance to be heard and realized that her dark path had ended. Oliver Lane, Like the Wind on the Loose.
Oliver Lane was 12 when he became part of a criminal gang. His playful laugh and mischievous behavior hid the truth about his life. Storms raged inside him, and no one suspected how quickly his life could go off the rails. He often wandered the streets, looking for adventure and dreaming of becoming a hero. But, as it often happens, dreams turned into a reality full of cruelty. Oliver lived with his mother, who had long suffered from addiction. He often found himself alone, and his only friends were other boys from nearby streets. They drew him into a world full of adrenaline, but also full of violence and crime. Oliver never thought about the consequences. He just lived for the moment. One day, he found himself in a situation where he had to choose to become a victim or a predator. During one of his altercations with another group of teenagers, Oliver lost control. In a fit of rage, he shoved his opponent, who fell and hit his head on a rock. At the trial, when it came time to decide his fate, Oliver looked into his mother's eyes, full of despair. She couldn't believe her son had ended up in such a situation. Unable to bear it, she lunged at the judge, screaming that her child couldn't be a killer. But her suffering only made things worse, and Oliver found himself trapped in a world with no way out. Each of these stories is not just a chronicle of crimes, but a reflection of the tragedies happening within each child's soul. These children became victims of a system that either couldn't or wouldn't pay attention to their suffering. By the way, if you're looking for work, can write scripts, and have skills in editing or voiceover, you have the chance to join our team. Message our Telegram bot. Link in the description.